Welcome to News from Neptune for January 24th, the fourth week of 2020. I'm Carl Estabrook. The socialist Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a self-proclaimed socialist government in Germany in the aftermath of World War I, said the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. Remarkably enough, we seem to be verging on a discussion in this country of what the term socialist means, thanks to Bernie Sanders. It's not easy owing to generations of U.S. propaganda. Noam Chomsky, who inspires our program, says terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism, in Karl Marx's sense, in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared by the 1920s. Every industrial society today is one form or another of state capitalism. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes who called themselves socialist made immense strides in the 20th century, notably in Russia and China. Since 1919, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either to repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I, with the help of J.B. Nicholson, will try to say some true things on a "What War?" edition of News from Neptune. You got some war-related reflections, David, or you want to go somewhere else?
Well, I'll get to the war.
It'll
still be
we
there.
seem to.
It'll still be there when I
Right.
get back to it.
Right.
One thing that came to my notice today was that Noam Chomsky, the aforementioned mentor of this program, has signed a letter, along with other notables, including Barbara Ehrenreich. She noted for many things, including the denotation professional managerial class. They just less than a dozen or so people signed a letter advising the Green Party to basically butt out and of the presidential campaign in 2020, or at least to perhaps tentatively or temporarily butt out. I basically agree with the assumption of this letter when it comes to support for Bernie Sanders. It seems like there's an enormous amount of momentum for Bernie Sanders coming from various quarters, including even on Counterpunch. I didn't read Jeffrey's column this morning. He's usually
talking about something else.
A little more cynical about Sanders, but Paul Street, who also tends to be cynical, is all in for Sanders, as is Rob Urry, who I find the most astute Counterpunch commentator these days, which is to say the most Marxist Counterpunch commentator these days. What was a little discordant about the Chomsky Ehrenreich et al. Letter was that it included the name Elizabeth Warren as among the people who are good enough to replace Donald Trump. And I'm having an increasingly, it was already jaundiced view. I don't know what the next level after jaundiced is.
Yellow fever, I think.
Yeah. It's something very yellow.
Yes.
And, you can listen, as I do, to the podcast What's Left from a few days ago, in the wake of the brouhaha at the Democratic debate last week, in which Warren's lying self really came to the forefront, and all the fallout from that. I realize that's been talked about on Jimmy Dore. It's been talked about in numerous places. I really like the take that Benjamin Studebaker and his co-host have on the What's Left podcast, because they've been on to Warren's shtick for a long time, and she's a liar going way back. And I don't think I can support her, even against Donald Trump. I know that may shock people to say that, but I don't see, unless she kind of quote unquote honestly wins the Democratic Party, which can't possibly happen.
That's right.
She can't honestly
That's so
win
unlikely.
the Democratic Party. I mean, it will have to be as a result of her machinations or those of the corporate DNC leaders for her or Buttigieg or Amy Klobuchar or whomever to defeat Bernie Sanders. And in that case, I don't understand why I should fall in line to support this lying liar. And so I take exception with Noam and Barbara regarding her being lumped in with Bernie Sanders. Whatever problems I have with Bernie Sanders, I think he's coming across very clearly as a class-based candidate, as a real move forward, at least in the context of our ridiculous electoral system. And so that's what's going on in the world of electoral politics. Let me just add what Paul Street said in his sort of endorsement of Bernie this morning. He said towards the end, the column was mostly about Trump and the impeachment process and so on and so forth. But Paul Street goes, Bernie, it would be good for you and your friends like Michael Moore, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Noam Chomsky to join Dr. Cornel West, myself, and the group Refuse Fascism in trying to get the word out to the working class citizen majority, we need thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, and then millions in the street, day after day, week after week, demanding Trump and Pence, quote unquote, out now, capital O, capital N. And then Street goes on, we can't wait for the, quote, appallingly undemocratic Senate, quote unquote, or the money-soaked oligarchic electoral process and the endlessly self-fulfilling nothingness of lesser evil electoralism to save us from the rising menace of an accelerating American shift to fascism. So here, Paul Street is falling back into the sort of the anti-neo-fascist trope that he has been pounding on for many months now, and which admittedly Trump and his cohorts are doing a lot to kind of give some validity to in this whole process, especially with the assassination of Soleimani. So is that enough on the table for you to respond to, Carl?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I've spent the week watching the Senate debate impeachment. I couldn't tear myself away from this dramatic television, And
Thank you for doing that, so I didn't have to. I haven't watched it for 1 minute.
Once again, I'm not entirely serious.
Okay.
So.
You're not serious. Okay. Raise your hand when you're not serious.
Oh, okay. That's not a bad idea.
Okay.
I am serious on this. The best account of what the Senate is doing this week has come on Tucker Carlson's program on Fox News, to my amazement. The Clinton News Network, CNN, and MSDNC, which I always get wrong, that is the Democratic Party cable shows, have told me about what's going on this week and how important it is. It's very hard for me to see the importance, and therefore I, in fact, found it very easy to tear myself away from it. But there is something going on here. The mouthpiece, so to speak, of the political establishment, New York Times, its editorial board labored and brought forth a mouse, and it brought forth an objection to Bernie Sanders, your presumed front-runner for the Democratic nomination. The New York Times editorial board wrote, quote, "There's how Mr. Sanders approaches politics. He boasts that compromise is anathema to him." Only his prescriptions can be the right ones, even though most are overly rigid, untested, and divisive. He promises that once in office, a groundswell of support will emerge to push through his agenda. 3 years into the Trump administration, we see little advantage to exchanging one overpromising, divisive figure in Washington for another. Close quote. That's
Wow.
yeah.
Thank you, Barry Weiss.
Yeah.
Barry Weiss is the New York Times editorial board member.
But
I
this-
don't know that she wrote that, but
But it represents the views of the
neocon Zionist.
exactly of the New York Times editorial board, which represents the views of the American political establishment. This is serious, and to my amazement, there's a serious point in it. The serious point is the backhanded acknowledgement by the New York Times editorial board, not just evil figures within it, the acknowledgement by the leading mouthpiece of the U.S. political establishment that Trump and Sanders are both supported by the burgeoning populist movement, which rejects the neocon and neolib policies, the policies of more war and more austerity that have characterized all U.S. administrations for more than a generation. So they recognize the situation. They see what's happening here, and attempts to force it back into the tired tropes of left and right to suggest that obviously we have to take seriously the standard political arguments in this country that reject both Trump and Sanders.
Except that Sanders really does reject neoliberalism and neoconservatism.
No,
to a
I'm
certain
sorry.
extent.
I didn't say that well.
Whereas Trump doesn't really reject those
You-
in practice.
But we have to the question is not so much what Trump believes, if there is such a thing.
Yes.
The question is what made him president.
Yes,
What made
yes.
him president was the rejection of neoliberalism and neoconservatism.
I think I've heard that before.
Well, I was going to say, but you have failed to take the final step and accept it.
No, I accept that. Oh no, I've argued from the very start, Carl, that it wasn't a bunch of white racists who
Yeah.
put Trump into office.
That's
That it
it.
was a bunch of people who may be white racists, but are also
more importantly-
living in places that they have seen
Exactly.
deteriorate over the last 30 or 40 years.
But the point is that if we talk about it in terms of left and right, we won't get very far. What we have to see, first of all, is that what made Trump president is what is making Sanders the front runner among the Democrats, and that is opposition to those neolib and neocon policies. So we have to ask ourselves what sort of electoral strategy will take advantage of that opposition, will fulfill that opposition to neolib and neocon policies. Your point a moment ago was that Trump had talked that move, but hadn't made that move. In office, Trump fell back into the neolib and neocon policies of the previous administration. But the point is that there is clearly a demand in the electorate for a candidate who will reject those policies. How do we accomplish that? You started off this evening with the suggestion that we should put the Greens aside because the Greens might get in the way of virtue triumphing in the next election.
That's not mine. That's Noam Chomsky's.
Well,
suggestion.
we might read that letter a little differently, but in any case, the question is whether that's right. You and I have both been Green Party candidates. Well, I was a Green Party candidate.
You were
and you were the surgeon. You were, yes.
I was a Green Party candidate in my own mind, but not really anywhere
exactly.
else.
Right. What the Green Party should do this year, as I thought you were arguing, depends in some sense on whom the Democrats nominate. That if they nominate Warren, who does seem to be a turncoat, the Green Party should
I don't think her coat was
proceed.
ever turned in the first place.
Well-
I mean, she's just who she is. And
Well,
she's
but she's not very
she's a
candid about the
neoliberal.
point.
She's
Yes.
a neoliberal through and through.
And so, what should the Green Party do? Answer: if Trump is nominated, they should. What's the Yiddish for sit down and shut up? Stumm? Stumm?
I don't know. I should know that. But
If Sanders is nominated, the Green Party should sit down and shut up.
Yeah.
If Warren is nominated, hey, let it rip. Do what you can.
Yeah,
You
well-
sort of agree with that.
yeah, I do, and that's
You
the
do
part
agree
of
with
the-
that, yes.
I mean, strangely enough, Louis Proyek posted this, and this is the way I found out about it, because he doesn't agree with it, even though he hates the Green Party. This is how confusing this gets.
Well-
He hates Jill Stein.
He hates too many people.
Because he hates everyone, but just the idea that there should be a working class, he thinks that the idea that there should be that working class people shouldn't align ever with either political party.
That's an arguable
that-
position.
Yeah, but not but in the face of Bernie Sanders and what the real politics on the ground are at this point in time. I mean, of course, he goes overboard in his invective in the manner in which he rejects it. But I have to give him one thing: when Michael Maripol, the surviving son of the Rosenbergs, who were executed in 1953, when he doesn't agree with Lewis on the Marx Mail list, he doesn't get called names. That's what you get for being
For sacrificing your
for
parents.
sacrificing your parents. So anyway, that's a little insider politics, but there you have it.
I'm still sort of probing the question of
Yeah.
do we disagree much, or do we disagree with Chomsky and friends? And I'm not sure we do, except for the possibility that one should not one should sit down and shut up if Elizabeth Warren is nominated. Neither of us think that's correct.
No, I really don't. That's going to be some heavy lifting to convince me to support this pretty awful woman. There's a nice drawing. There's a woman who draws on Mondo Weiss, who draws cartoons or graphic depictions of various stories, and there's Katie Miranda is her name, and she has a cartoon of Elizabeth Warren bending over and looking through her legs in contorted positions of various kinds, which I found quite funny. One more little side note here. It's going to be interesting to see what how the New York Times moves forward with this, with its critique of Bernie Sanders that you just referred to. Or how CNN moves forward, as it has to kind of accommodate the fact that, as Jimmy Dore has pointed out, its ratings depend on attracting some Sanders voters. So we saw this. Jimmy Dore posted this debate between the very good Crystal Ball and this Democratic Party Clinton operative, and how they interacted on CNN. Meanwhile, excuse me. Meanwhile, I opened the New York Times this morning as they had done something to keep me from stealing it, and then I had to figure out how to steal it. I've heard that they actually want you to steal it, so I'm going to keep doing it.
Okay.
But there was some technical glitch that I had to figure out to keep stealing it, and when I stole it this morning, I found that Liz Bruenig had moved from the Washington Post to the New York Times opinion page, which is, in my little world, in my little podcast world, is a kind of interesting development. She is
As Yogi Berra said, a trade that hurts both teams, right?
Yeah. yeah. Well, we'll see about that. Wonder what. I mean, I know who Liz Bruenig is, and I know that she's willing to participate in corporate media up to a point, and that her husband Matt Bruenig is solidly in the Sanders camp, as she is in a somewhat different way. Matt Bruenig does the People's Policy Project, which under which Elizabeth Warren gets skewered in a much more wonky way than she does on the What's Left podcast. But so Liz Bruenig is now writing in the editorial, but so something is up here. She thinks that she's okay. She's made it. She's not even 30 years old yet, and she's made it. She's on the opinion page of the New York Times. However often, but what's up with the New York Times hiring her? Is she better, to refer to another quote? Is she better on the inside than on the outside?
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I think that's probably right. I also remember when Alex Coburn
Right.
was writing for the Wall Street Journal
and
so
the
forth.
LA Times for
Exactly,
many years.
and his politics were clearly different,
Yeah.
to put it too mildly, from those of the Wall Street Journal. But the Wall Street Journal put him on the editorial page as sort of a safety valve, a look how liberal we are, that we can encompass all views because we're so confident in our own. That didn't last for very long, but it did last for a while. And in the meantime, Coburn, who was nobody's fool, took the occasion to talk rather elegantly about the concerns of the readership of the Wall Street Journal and why they were wrong. That's just no bad thing. And if Bruenig ends up doing something similar, more power to her. What she's been doing recently, which may have something to do with this, is writing extremely funny stories about her 3-year-old. And,
And she has a newborn also.
Exactly.
3 or 4 months old.
In talking about the trials of parenthood, she has her wit is very much in place.
It is. But the question sort of becomes, given the New York Times wants to be able to say, in the final analysis, when somebody other than Sanders gets nominated, they want to be able to say that their newspaper gave the Sanders campaign a quote-unquote fair shot.
Yes,
And
which
that
of course they didn't.
They lost fair and square. They had Liz Bruenig writing nice things about Bernie Sanders, as opposed to all the jaundiced things, including what you read at the start of this program. I may be overthinking it somewhat. I mean, she's just She's basically a kind of talent. She's I don't know, you might want to relate her to someone like Russell Baker or someone like that,
Yes.
who's really,
Less political.
Right. Baker was,
Yes.
but still in the sort of literary New York Times, New Yorker fashion.
That's
of,
good
of
comparison.
Liberalism. So, lots to chew on there.
Yes, indeed. Your deal, or shall I?
Well, I've got stuff, but you haven't really had much of a turn yet. I'm starting to feel sorry for you.
Hey, look, we've been doing this 30 years. We get the turns. What goes around comes around. What I have been bemused by this week, I often am, is the Senate's show, which I think is not playing in Peoria. The Democrats in the Senate, including the Adam Schiff creature, who clearly is an alien. I only have to watch him for a little while to realize that his ancestors are not human. But in any case, they have been putting on a carefully rehearsed, polished show that highlights the word cheat, trying to insist that the president has to be driven from office because he cheated. And cheating has to do with a very strange account of something that went on in Ukraine. As I say, if someone reading this a generation ago, or probably if there's anyone around to do it, a generation from now, will have trouble believing that this was a reasonable approach on the part of the Democrats. The idea that the president should be dismissed from office because he spoke to Ukrainian officials in a way that he thought might help his reelection is condemned as cheating and rigging, and that's enough, according to the Democrats. The real things that Trump should be impeached and removed from office for, such as killing the Iranian general, and carrying on the war policy of the previous administration, and even when he says he doesn't intend to, those things are being ignored. What is being showcased is a peculiar account of actions in regard to Ukraine, and the full story, even most of the story, of what actually has gone on between the U.S. and Ukraine as part of the American government's war provocations against Russia, which is not an accident. They're an attempt to try to control the Russian economy that the U.S. has been doing vigorously ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, and indeed before. Instead of concentrating on that, the whole point is to try to show that Orange Man bad, the president cheated or rigged. And once we've done that, then we can all go home. Well, I hope that's true. I hope we can all go home. But as our researcher J.B. Nicholson says, let's be clear about who is rigging what. It's Donald Trump's actions to use the power of the federal government for his own political benefit that's the cause of the impeachment trial. Democrats are going to unite to sweep him out of the White House in November. That's sorry, I've said Nicholson. That's Sanders. That's Bernie Sanders backing the.
As opposed to Barry Sanders, who used to be a fullback for the Detroit Lions.
It was very well. Okay, we're dealing with multiple confusions here, but you knew that anyhow, right?
Yeah.
Let me step back here and quote Sanders' comment. Picked out for us by our researcher. Sanders said, given the Democrats' concentration on rigging, he says, let's be clear about who is rigging what. It's Donald Trump's action to use the power of the federal government for his own political benefit that is the cause of the impeachment trial. Democrats are going to unite to sweep him out of the White House in November. Now, that's exactly the argument from Bernie Sanders in this case, that's being used by the Democrats to monopolize our television sets this week. We can talk about Sanders and Warren and the other Democratic possibilities here as much as you want, but let's notice that the Russiagate nonsense is being prolonged by the Democratic Party, including Bernie Sanders, to attack the president on this peripheral at best charge. It's not peripheral if you explain what exactly the U.S. government has done in regard to Ukraine to the last 2 years, but that's in the last few years. But that never comes into the argument. What comes into the argument is did Trump cheat? And Bernie Sanders buys it. So the week is largely a dead loss, I think, as far as reasonable American policy is concerned.
And it's keeping Sanders off the campaign trail.
Well, that's the point.
Out of Iowa.
That's
which
the point.
I think Paul Street also noted, or somebody noted this morning.
That's the point that I really was trying to get to.
Yeah.
There's really only, this is from Jeff Nicholson again,
Yeah.
There's really only one rigging that is relevant in the context of Senator Bernie Sanders. The party he keeps working with rigged their primary to cheat him out of a fair shot at winning their nomination in 2016. The lawsuit that came from this cheating informed us all that the DLC Corporation can choose their own representative regardless of what the primary voters say. This is the stopgap finding the Democrats have. The representative of the DNC quoted during the lawsuits about the despoliation of the Sanders campaign last time, he says, we're going to, choose our standard bearer. This is the Democratic National Committee talking. We're going to choose our standard bearer, and we're going to follow these general rules of the road, which we are voluntarily deciding we could have, and we could have voluntarily decided that, look, we're going to go into back rooms the way they used to and smoke cigars and pick the candidate that way. That's not the way it was done, but they could have, and that would have been all right, close quote. That's the Democratic National Committee's position. That if the primaries go badly wrong, they can simply ignore it, or they can rig the convention, finally, to ignore that result. They don't want that result to occur, but the more examples there are of the populist wave putting up two populist candidates, two apparently populist candidates, Trump and Sanders, against one another, is the nightmare of the Democratic National Committee, and they have several stoppages put in along the way, including the possibility, being here defended, that they simply can ignore what the primaries say. So, there are features of interest in the present situation.
Ever since we have had this primary system, which has only been in place in its current form since the early 70s, the Democratic Party, it transitioned from the back room to the primary system, but it wasn't a very meaningful change in terms of who was really running the party and how various interest groups in the party and various identity groups, more importantly, identity groups, were able to determine who the nominees would be. This is the first time that a class-based candidate, aka Bernie Sanders, has been able to kind of transcend, not a very good word, but to at least shape the campaign in terms of a class-based program. It's also a very youth-based program, and as much as I don't like doing generational things, it's pretty clear, and this was true in Britain also in relation to Jeremy Corbyn. The Labour Party there was all young, and there wouldn't be a Tory party if everybody was young, and there wouldn't be a Labour Party if everyone was old.
Which is practically the case. Yes.
That's how stark that's how stark the generational differences are, and they might not be quite as stark in this country, and it isn't clear. There's, you've got Warren kind of muddying up the waters, but it's clear that the identity approach, the we need a woman in the White House approach, is being superseded by the we need someone who represents the working class. And the Democratic Party is busily trying to deal with this.
And so as a result, this week we got, first of all, peculiar adumbrations of a Clinton candidacy for the White House. I mean, kind of, it's like Halloween, there's a skeleton in a closet out there that's making noises, and she's making very peculiar noises, which is not surprising, but they seem to get more and more peculiar, including the lovely suggestion that Tulsi Gabbard is a Russian agent. She's being groomed by the Russians, etc. And I must say, I support Tulsi Gabbard. I've contributed to her campaign and so forth, but I still must say that I was very pleased to see her sue Clinton for defamation on this issue. Hey, go, Tulsi, give it a shot. The suit can't go anyplace. It's not possible, I think, for the courts to take any of that seriously, but it does point out just how madly dangerous or dangerously mad Hillary Clinton is. So, you go, Tulsi.
Yeah, just one little leftover here from our discussion of what Paul Street had to say. I think the question is, when are people in the streets the people in the streets? I mean, what would Paul Street say? What would Paul Street say if millions of Trump supporters went to the streets to keep him from being removed from office if he should be convicted? Not
entirely out of the question.
It's easy for people on the left to look. I mean, we have people in the streets, and then we have people in the streets in various countries. We've seen how U.S. foreign policy plays itself out by putting people in the streets in other countries against governments we don't like. But what's happening, and this relates to the New York Times this morning, I looked at the Angry Arab website, and he's claiming that Twitter is keeping the demonstrations in Baghdad from being Twittered properly so that people understand how many millions of people in that country or in that city want the U.S. out.
No.
So there's all kinds of things going on here.
Well, that point is an important one. There are major demonstrations in Iraq right now in support of the Iraq government's demand that the U.S. troops leave Iraq. But that's certainly being played down in mainstream media, if mentioned at all, and even perhaps by Twitter, which, like Facebook, does an awful lot of political censorship. And the demands, the actual demands of the Iraqi people, which seem to be at stake here, have been censored from our social media. And so most people don't know that these demonstrations are taking place. If this presidential campaign has done anything in the process of trying to suppress the populist wave in this country, it's made us ever more aware of how filtered the news that we get from American media in general, mainstream media particularly, how filtered that is. That cannot be a bad thing. And so in the meantime, we should try to find out what's really going on.
Yeah, well, I guess Paul Street thinks that if it's Trump people in the streets, they're going to go out beating people up and so forth. But what if the Trump people come out with their flowers and their love beads and you know, their MAGA hats, their MAGA hats turned on backwards or something,
right. Mm-hmm.
And they could be just they're the people too. And I don't know how many of these Trump people that Paul Street thinks are, you know, when he refers to them, I mean, I suppose there's millions of people that are just diehard racist Trump supporters, but what percentage of those are the people who actually voted for Trump, and aren't they people too?
It's a very good point, and it seems to me that when we talk about the perversion of the Make America Great Again motto in the hands of its opponents, we do have to realize that for many American voters, what Make America Great Again meant was the actual fact that the life chances of a good bit of the American population had declined in a generation, and the greatness of America they have in mind are the life chances that existed in their parents' time. Yeah. That's been turned in. The Democratic Party has worked very hard to turn that into the views of deplorables and racists. But one can hardly deny that there may be some deplorables and racists among that. There probably are some of them elsewhere too. But
some of our best friends.
But the notion that the MAGA line doesn't represent a real concern for political transformation that's at the heart of the populist movement in this country, that's a mistake.
Yeah. So let me just drop something in here.
Okay.
Because I haven't really been watching the news very much this week, or even YouTube very much this week.
You've been focused entirely on the Senate, I know.
Yeah. Well, you're right. Sure, I've been focused on. No, I've been focused on the 1619 project,
yes.
and reading about things related to that. But meanwhile, I do want to say the one thing that fascinated me this week was Aaron Mate's interview with Scott Ritter. There's a short one and a long one. The long one mainly has to do with Ritter's experience before the I guess we should say second Iraq War in 2003 as a nuclear weapons inspector, but also his understanding of Joe Biden's who we haven't even mentioned yet today.
Probably a good thing.
And he wouldn't forget.
The right way to go.
He probably wouldn't know if we had or hadn't. But still, that it was fascinating to hear this insider account of what Joe Biden had really done and how utterly obnoxious Joe Biden. Scott Ritter was interrogated basically in the Senate by Joe Biden in a really obnoxious way, and
what a surprise!
And back in the days when Biden was still well put together enough to be kind of glib and kind of fancy in the way he talked to people, but anyway, and also just wanted to mention this fellow Jim Kavanaugh has an article right at the top of Counterpunch this morning about Soleimani and how admired he was and how we don't understand. He says, so to understand Soleimani in Western terms, you'd have to evoke someone like World War II Eisenhower or Marshal Zhukov, but that gets another blank stare. And so he's trying to help us to understand what it is that, how it is that that Soleimani is being viewed in Iraq in relation to his defeating ISIS and organizing the Iranian and Iraqi troops to defeat ISIS, and then kind of it got a little bit of a rise out of me. Kavanaugh goes on to an issue that we've discussed many times in this program. Wanted to get your response to this, Carl. He goes, the one big war makes perfect sense when one understands that the United States has thoroughly internalized Israel's interests as its own. That this conflation has been successfully driven by a particular neocon faction, and that it is excessive, unnecessary, and perhaps disruptive to other effective U.S. imperial possibilities. It is demonstrated precisely by the constant complaint from non-neocon, including imperialist quarters, that it's also, quote unquote, senseless. The result is that the primary object of U.S. policy, its internalized Zionist imperative in this war, is to enforce that Israel must be able, without any threat of serious retaliation, to carry out any military attack on any country in the region at any time, to seize any territory and resources, especially water, it needs, and of course to impose any level of colonial violence against Palestinians, etc., etc. And I've never been persuaded by it's all about Israel, although I'm the only slight opening I would have to that would be given the kind of people that have ascended to power within the Trump administration, especially obviously in relation to foreign policy. I'm wondering if you would all think that there's a door open to what we've called in the past the Israel lobby thesis. This isn't so much the lobby thesis, but the neocons in the White House thesis.
And what it comes down to is the charge that American foreign policy is being directed not in the interest of Americans, but in the interest of Israel.
Yes,
yes. That's the issue. And the problem is there's a germ of truth in that, to the extent that we have to be careful about how we say it in order to get it accurate. It is not the case that American ruling class interests have been hijacked by Israel to different interests. It is the case that American ruling class interests in the realm of foreign policy here's the problem we have with the language, they're coordinated with the policy of the Israeli ruling establishment, and the policies are remarkably conjoint. Okay, that's a little different from saying it's the Jews who are running our policy.
Yeah, right.
And that difference should be recognized, because the real interests of American foreign policy should be recognized. The way in which the U.S. Is continuous in its foreign policy activities has to be recognized, and the fact that Israel and the apartheid state that exists in Israel right now is comfortable, to put no finer point on it, with those interests should be recognized. But the idea that Israel is somehow running American foreign policy in a way contrary to what the American ruling class wants, that's false. And what we have to realize, the horrible things we have to realize, is what American ruling class policy actually is, and why Israel is useful to that policy, and therefore the willingness of the United States to continue to support an apartheid state is our fault as much as theirs. I mean, this is not new.
You're not buying it. I'm kind of surprised Kavanaugh went in that direction, but I don't know. It's like everybody it's like this business just keeps pounding and pounding and pounding on people until they just go over the edge when it comes to Israel. And
I think the modes may be a little different. We don't want to believe that the American ruling class interests, American ruling class policy is as vicious as it is in the interests of the American 1%, and is willing to ignore different notions that come from the American political establishment. We want to think we can influence American foreign policy. We probably can't, but we should at least understand what it is and whose interest it does serve, and not substitute the Israeli ruling class for the American ruling class.
Well, I think what the implication is, may not be right, but the implication of what someone like Kavanaugh is saying is that Jared Kushner is making a qualitative difference in that topic, in relation to that topic.
And that
or
isn't
that
true.
Jared Kushner and John Bolton and Mike Pence with his sort of dispensationalist Christianity or evangelical Zionism or whatever you want to call it.
It should be more dispensationalist, right? Sorry.
Yeah. So I don't know. Anyway, that's I'm not really buying it either. But there you go. There it is, right at the top of the Counterpunch website this morning.
That interview by Aaron Maté with Scott Ritter, who has an interesting political history himself, that interview we played on the Tuesday program, Aware on the Air, which is devoted to war topics.
I was wondering why you had such a short program.
Yeah, that was
because that was about a 40-minute interview.
That's
right?
about a 40-minute interview. And if you want to see that interview, or if you want to read that interview, go to the link on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air, and I'll put it on the Facebook page for News from Neptune as well.
And it's called it's a little confusing, but the general operation that Aaron is doing with Max Blumenthal, et cetera, is called the Gray Zone.
Right.
And within the Gray Zone, you have Moderate Rebels, which is Blumenthal and Ben Norton's podcast. And then within that, you also have Aaron's pushback program, which you can access on YouTube, probably on its own or through the Gray Zone channel.
And most of this stuff is available on YouTube, and it's worthwhile just surveying the sorts of things you can find on YouTube. I don't know how long this is going to last, this availability of dissident news and political reporting on YouTube, but for the moment that it exists, it should be taken advantage of. I recommend it highly.
Well, it's probably worth funding the Gray Zone if you believe in their work, because there's not that many other people doing it. I have a feeling Jimmy Dore is making plenty of money on his own. He probably doesn't need my money, but the Gray Zone probably does.
Well, it's an interesting notion, perhaps. Yeah. I'm not sure Jimmy would agree with that. But
yeah, but Jimmy really isn't a fundraiser anyway. He's not really asking for money. You could probably give it to him, but he's not asking for it.
One note here about Sanders and foreign policy. We've been talking about some of these observations we've had from Jeff Nicholson, who does research for us on this. And Jeff points out that it's not out of the question to see the current situation in the Democratic Party repeating what happened in the 2016 election, where Sanders ends up not with the nomination, indeed cheated out of the nomination, and then endorsing the party candidate, who of course was Hillary Clinton last time around. I want to believe that in those dire circumstances, Sanders wouldn't do that, but on the other hand, well, it certainly is a possibility. Jeff points out that Sanders is not different than his opponents on foreign policy. There's been some movement on that recently, but not much. one hopes from him more than repeating CIA talking points, as Sanders did in reaction to the U.S. coup attempts against Venezuela. That was definitely shocking. Jeff says, I still don't buy the Democrats would rather win in 2020 with Sanders than lose with someone that better reflects the Democrats' actual policies, more austerity and more war, like Buttigieg, Biden, or Warren. I don't see strong evidence the Democratic Party elites fail to get what they want when Democrats aren't president. Hence, I believe Democrats don't care if they lose the presidential race and therefore can always afford to push for someone like Clinton, Biden, Warren, or Buttigieg. I think that's probably right. And the question of what Bernie Sanders will do if he's cheated out of the nomination is the precedents are not good there. Precedents are not happy. Precedents. Pardon the puns. The situation is fairly serious, and I think the best result, as Glenn Ford of Black Agenda Report suggests, the best result possible is the destruction of the Democratic Party when Sanders is denied the nomination. That may be true, and in that sense, I think Chomsky's hesitations about the Green Party are probably out of place in the circumstance that Sanders is once again rigged out of the presidential race.
Yeah, it should be noted, as long as we were discussing the New York Times at length, their editorial endorsement of two candidates,
right,
Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar. Kind of a strange. I didn't read the actual editorial. That was when it was before I'd figured out how to steal it again. But gosh, how transparent can you be? So.
Yeah. You're watching News from Neptune. We have a few minutes left. Do you want to?
Yeah, let me just refer, as long as we're in the wake of Martin Luther King Day.
Okay.
Let's refer back to the 1619 Project. Tom Mackaman, formerly known to us,
friend of this ground,
has been doing good work on the WSWS website in relation to the 1619 Project. And in honor of MLK, he interviewed Claiborne Carson, who was the primary historian, archivist of the Martin Luther King documents and papers and life and so forth out at Stanford. And what Claiborne Carson, a very considered, I think, deservedly well-respected historian, wrote this, a little out of context, but let me just do this. Both Gandhi and King were Enlightenment figures in the same way Toussaint Louverture was. They are seeing the possibilities in this movement that in their time is dominated by white males. What they did is in their most profound speeches and writings. For Gandhi, it's in his writings, and for King, it's more in his speeches, is to say, why should it be limited to that? That is, why should rights be limited to white males? If there is this notion, this ideal that every human being has certain rights that other human beings should respect, and if a couple hundred white men can go into a room in Philadelphia and create a nation, why can't we declare we want another kind of nation? That we want a different kind of society? And the only thing that's really stopping that is our own imagination. King does this in his most famous speeches, starting with Montgomery. You have this movement that is a bus boycott. We want to sit wherever we want on a bus. So that's a very concrete right, and Rosa Parks asserted that. Then they organize a boycott, and King is asked to be the leader of it. He gives his first speech, and what does he do? He says, you may think that what you're doing is fighting for a seat at the front of the bus, but I'm here to tell you that you're fighting for human rights. You're fighting for the Declaration of Independence, the Sermon on the Mount. In his first speech, he lays it all out. This is not about a seat at the front of the bus. It's about much more than that. Use your imagination. And why this is remarkable at this point in time is that this series that the World Socialist website is doing is devoted to countering the 1619 Project, the New York Times 1619 Project, which basically writes Martin Luther King out of the history of this country, out of the racial history of this country, out of the, let's say, progressive history of this country, and Claiborne Carson is being set up in a kind of good way here to put it back in to make their point. And it's kind of fascinating to me that we celebrate ML King Day, and I listened to the program on WEFT Radio, Higher Ground, this past Saturday. You can get it on their website. You can get a recording of it on their website. And I heard Carol and Aaron Ammons talking all about MLK Day and all the things MLK did, whereas in previous weeks they'd be talking about the 1619 Project. But what they don't seem to understand is that MLK was written out of the 1619 Project, and there's a political reason for that. We don't have enough time to talk about that. I wouldn't have enough time to explain it, but this is some very fascinating stuff going on here, politically speaking. If
we want to say it in a short way, though, we might say that there is an interesting battle going on right now between what you might call race reductionism, it is called race reductionism, and what is also called class reductionism. The problem is people who use those terms are usually not in favor of what they're talking about. Therefore, we don't have a neutral terminology here, but then that happens a lot with political terminology, that the name of movements and groups and so forth is taken from their opponents. What we're dealing with here is that the problem with Martin Luther King is that he was not only a civil rights leader, which can move in the direction of race reductionism, he was also an anti-war socialist. And the anti-war socialism is more profoundly threatening to establishment views in America these days than race reductionism is. They've learned how to handle race reductionism in an age of identity politics. Identity politics is a way to avoid class reductionism, a way to avoid the demands that arise out of exploitation by satisfying, or at least seeming to satisfy, the demands that arise out of discrimination. I'm actually quite surprised to see how demands arising from discrimination have been mobilized to oppose and vitiate demands arising out of exploitation. You need to do some history here. That's what the 1619 Project is doing, and it needs to be countered because we have to understand that American political problems are not just a matter of discrimination, they are finally a matter of exploitation.
So when Martin Luther King and the Ammons quoted him in this regard, as you would expect, regarding the sort of unholy trinity of capitalism, racism, and militarism, as he did in one of his famous speeches. I guess it was the one a year before he died, right, at the Riverside Church, in opposing before he was killed, right, and also opposing the Vietnam War. But we got to be careful here. Capitalism, racism, militarism. Well, it's capitalism. Not that there wasn't militarism before there was capitalism. That's a different story. But we've got to understand that capitalism is what we're dealing with here, and militarism is its most lethal face, whereas racism is awful, but it's poorly understood how that relates to how we get to the point that we're at this historical juncture.
As Adolf Reed says, if in this view, it's appropriate that the society be run by 10% of the population, just so long as that 10% of the population include 12%. 12% of that 10% is black. Whatever the appropriate percentage is gay, so forth and so on. That's what disparity politics and race reductionism gives us, and that's not enough.
I'm glad that Carol and Aaron Ammons support Bernie Sanders. I'm glad that Martin Luther King's words and his anti-war views and his socialist views resonate with them. They need to relate that to their support for the 1619 Project. It isn't just a kind of intellectual issue. It gets to the heart of what Democratic Party politics is doing at this time.
And we need to be willing to criticize Bernie Sanders' views on foreign policy and some other issues as well, not just recognize that he is frightening the political establishment to death. That's not enough. We've got to talk about what those things he should be saying and isn't saying.
We're done.
Kevin, 2 minutes.
Oh, okay.
2 minutes. Final comment?
Well, no, that's, I'll leave it there.
I think we can leave it there.
Yeah.
You have been watching News from Neptune for the fourth week of 2020, a What War edition. The idea was to talk about the fact, how come we're not talking about the war making the U.S. is doing around the world? And we celebrated that point by not talking about the war making that the U.S. is doing around the world. But we'll come back to that. Because unfortunately, the war is not going away. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Kevin Lau. See the research notes on the Facebook page for News from Neptune from J.B. Nicholson. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies and a good night to you.